For decades, we've been told that Bigfoot is a nocturnal monster, a shadow hiding strictly in the dark timber. But at high noon in August 1998, under the blinding summer sun, my camera captured something that shattered that myth completely. A towering 9-foot giant carrying a heartbreaking burden. I buried this tape under my floorboards for nearly 30 years to protect what I saw, but it's finally time to share the truth. Before we look at the footage that proves these creatures love and mourn just like we do, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're interested in more deep dives and hidden stories about Bigfoot, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. By late August 1998, the oppressive summer heat had driven most of the local wildlife deep into the shadowed timber. The canyon was usually completely silent during these sweltering, unyielding afternoon hours. Yet the heavy, rhythmic snapping of large branches continued to echo loudly through the dry, steep valley. I had spent 3 grueling weeks perched precariously on the baking metal roof of my isolated cabin. This uncomfortable, dangerous vantage point provided me with a perfectly clear, unobstructed line of sight directly into the lower meadow. I was desperately determined to finally document the massive, unseen source of the terrifying nocturnal noises. The physical toll of this daily high-noon vigil was becoming entirely unbearable for my exhausted body. There was absolutely no shade on the steep pitch of the blistering, corrugated iron roof. I baked under the unshielded, punishing glare of the sun for hours on end, drinking warm water from a plastic canteen. My heavy, bulky, hi-8 camcorder rested on a folded towel to keep the internal electronics from completely melting. Most researchers swear that these elusive creatures only ever move under the impenetrable cover of absolute darkness. I was stubbornly betting my remaining sanity that the sheer, desperate thirst of the drought would eventually force a daytime mistake. At exactly 1:15 p.m., the suffocating, stagnant air of the canyon floor seemed to completely stop moving. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the midday sun baked the dry, yellow grass of the expansive meadow. Thick, shimmering heat waves aggressively distorted the visual boundary, separating the clearing from the dark tree line. Suddenly, a massive, incredibly solid shape slowly began to emerge from the chaotic, watery optical illusion. It pushed through the dense wall of dry pine boughs with a terrifying, undeniable physical permanence. The sheer, staggering scale of the moving figure instantly paralyzed my exhausted, sun-baked mind. I aggressively rubbed my stinging, sweat-filled eyes, desperately trying to clear my blurred, exhausted vision. This was absolutely not a fleeting, ambiguous shadow cast by a swaying, ancient pine tree. It was not a clever, deceptive trick of the harsh, blinding summer light playing against the rocky canyon wall. It was undeniably a massive, towering Bigfoot, stepping deliberately out into the wide, exposed, open space. The creature was completely, terrifyingly visible under the absolute, unshielded glare of the bright midday sun. Every single established rule regarding the supreme, evolutionary stealth of this legendary species was being violently broken before my eyes. The heavy, deliberate footfalls of the towering giant violently crushed the brittle, sun-baked sagebrush. The dry, aggressive snapping of the thick vegetation echoed like sharp pistol shots in the otherwise silent canyon. The dense yellow grass of the meadow effortlessly parted around the creature's massive, heavily muscled thighs. It made absolutely no instinctive attempt to utilize the natural surrounding camouflage of the deep forest edge. The creature was walking completely exposed, demonstrating a bizarre, almost reckless disregard for its own hidden survival. A deep, unsettling feeling of profound wrongness immediately washed over my trembling, terrified body. I frantically gripped the heavy black plastic casing of my sophisticated hi-8 video camcorder. I quickly raised the large, sensitive glass lens directly to my stinging, sweat-drenched right eye. The glaring, aggressive sunlight made the small digital viewfinder incredibly difficult to clearly read and properly focus. I aggressively mashed the red record button, praying the overheated internal magnetic tape mechanism would function. The small blinking red light finally illuminated, confirming that I was actively capturing an impossible, historical reality. I held my breath, desperately trying to stabilize the heavy camera against the steep pitch of the burning roof. The massive creature continued to slowly lumber directly toward the dead center of the expansive, dry meadow. It entirely ignored the cool, inviting shade of the towering hemlocks lining the edge of the clearing. The sheer, staggering physical width of the giant's broad shoulders completely dominated the small digital recording frame. I watched in absolute, terrifying awe as the legendary myth actively materialized into a heavy biological reality. The crisp, unforgiving daytime lighting completely eliminated any possibility of a misidentified bear or a wandering hiker. I was securing the holy grail of cryptozoology, yet I felt a suffocating wave of intense dread instead of triumph. As the digital autofocus finally managed to securely lock onto the moving, massive target, details emerged. I realized the creature was absolutely not walking with the fluid, predatory grace usually attributed to the species. The heavy, lumbering gait was entirely off, lacking the terrifying, effortless speed I had witnessed in older, grainy night clips. Every single massive step seemed to require an immense, agonizing output of raw physical effort. The brutal, unforgiving sun beat down mercilessly on the dark, heavily furred figure as it struggled forward. The terrifying, undeniable realization struck me that this magnificent, towering mountain giant was in profound, desperate distress. The entire sprawling canyon seemed to instinctively react to the heavy, agonizing struggle of the massive creature. The normal, chaotic hum of the summer cicadas was abruptly and completely silenced in the dry grass. Not a single native bird dared to call out from the safety of the surrounding ancient timber. The oppressive, sweltering heat acted like a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the entire tragic scene. The profound physical isolation of my distant off-grid cabin suddenly felt vastly more acute and terrifying than ever before. My entire universe shrank down to the small, glowing electronic rectangle of my camera's viewfinder. The towering anomaly finally stumbled into the clearest, most unobstructed section of the sun-drenched lower meadow. The sheer, staggering height of the massive hominid easily approached 9 feet tall in the bright daylight. The harsh, direct illumination beautifully caught the distinct, burnt sienna color of its thick, matted fur. But the creature's terrible, agonizing physical posture became the undeniable focal point through the clear glass lens. The giant's massive, heavily muscled shoulders were slumped entirely forward under a terrifying, unseen physical weight. Its massive head hung incredibly low to its chest, fighting an agonizing battle for every single stumbling inch of ground. The footage I captured that afternoon remains jarringly, undeniably clear even after all these years. The massive Sasquatch stood nearly 9 feet tall, dominating the dry yellow grass of the open meadow. The bright, unforgiving midday sun beautifully illuminated his thick fur, revealing a striking burnt sienna color. He absolutely wasn't gliding across the rugged terrain with the fluid, predatory grace usually attributed to his kind. Instead of the terrifying, effortless speed I had witnessed in older, grainy night clips, he was violently stumbling. Every single heavy footfall seemed completely uncoordinated, kicking up small clouds of dry, suffocating dust. His massive, heavy head hung incredibly low, almost completely buried within his thick, heavily muscled chest. The creature's broad, powerful shoulders were slumped forward in an unnatural, profoundly agonizing physical posture. It honestly looked as if the very atmosphere of the canyon had suddenly turned into solid lead. The immense, raw physical effort required for him to simply remain upright was painfully obvious through the lens. The sheer, terrifying momentum of his massive bulk seemed to be the only thing propelling him forward. I watched in absolute, stunned silence as the mythical apex predator struggled against an invisible, crushing weight. The bright, harsh daylight provided an unprecedented, terrifying level of microscopic detail on the high-8 magnetic tape. I could clearly see the thick, matted texture of his burnt sienna fur clinging to his massive frame. The heavy, coarse hair was completely plastered against his powerful back, with thick, shimmering layers of sweat. The brutal, unyielding summer heat of the exposed canyon was actively punishing his incredibly dense, mountain-adapted coat. He was physically built for the freezing, dark timber, completely vulnerable in the scorching, exposed valley floor. The digital autofocus of my camera whirred frantically, struggling desperately to lock onto the massive, staggering figure. Through the sensitive glass lens, the creature's massive, barrel-like chest became the undeniable focal point. I could clearly document the heavy, terribly labored rise and fall of his immense respiratory system. Every single desperate intake of the thin, scorching air visibly shook his massive, slumped shoulders. The sheer volume of oxygen he required just to continue stumbling forward was mathematically staggering to witness. He wasn't breathing with the calm, meditative rhythm I had always associated with these ancient sovereign giants. This was the frantic, ragged, and chaotic breathing of a massive biological engine rapidly approaching total failure. My hands began to shake violently against the burning, corrugated metal of my cabin roof. I desperately tightened my grip on the heavy camcorder, terrified of completely losing the historic, impossible frame. The physical strain of holding the heavy lens steady perfectly mirrored the agonizing struggle occurring in the meadow. I held my breath, trying to mentally will the massive, stumbling giant to find the safety of the shade. The creature's thick, leathery feet dragged heavily through the dry sagebrush, leaving deep, chaotic furrows behind him. He was completely destroying the pristine, hidden nature of his existence with every single agonizing step. The giant abruptly paused his erratic, stumbling march near the exact center of the sweltering, sun-baked clearing. He swayed dangerously on his massive legs, his thick knees visibly buckling under his own immense weight. The camera captured a terrifying, vulnerable moment where it seemed the towering patriarch would completely collapse. He planted his massive, flat feet incredibly wide apart to establish a desperate, temporary center of gravity. The heavy, ragged heaving of his massive chest briefly intensified as he fought to remain standing. It was an incredibly intimate, profoundly heartbreaking display of raw, physical vulnerability from an undisputed apex predator. I kept the powerful, optical zoom tightly locked directly onto his massive, sweat-drenched upper torso. I was absolutely terrified that the intense, unrelenting summer heat would finally fry the internal camera electronics. But the heavy hi-8 tape faithfully continued to spin, permanently recording the giant's agonizing midday struggle. The creature slowly raised his massive, heavy head, briefly looking up at the blinding, unforgiving sun. His thick, heavily browed face was completely obscured by the dark, matted hair hanging in his eyes. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion radiating from his massive frame felt incredibly, profoundly human to my watching eyes. This staggering, unprecedented daylight footage completely shattered the aggressive, monstrous caricature perpetuated by modern folklore. The stumbling giant was not a violent, bloodthirsty beast actively hunting for prey in the high timber. He was a deeply vulnerable, highly complex biological entity pushed to the absolute limits of physical endurance. The unshielded midday sun had violently stripped away the terrifying, supernatural mystique of the ancient forest legend. I was simply watching a massive, heavily muscled father struggling desperately to survive a brutal, unforgiving environment. The profound, undeniable empathy I felt for the struggling creature entirely overrode my initial paralyzing fear. He slowly shifted his massive weight, turning his broad, thick back slightly away from the dense tree line. The subtle, agonizing rotation of his massive torso dramatically changed the entire angle of the harsh sunlight. The digital lens finally captured the full, terrifying context of his awkward, heavily hunched physical posture. His thick, powerful arms were not hanging loosely or aggressively swinging at his massive, fur-covered sides. They were firmly wrapped around a heavy, dark shape, held tightly against his broad, heaving chest. The giant was not stumbling entirely because of the oppressive heat or his own sheer physical exhaustion. The camera's digital autofocus finally snapped into perfect, terrifying clarity on the massive, sienna-colored chest. I gasped audibly, the dry, hot air tearing painfully at my parched, completely neglected throat. The massive, staggering stride of the giant suddenly made perfect, heartbreaking sense in the bright sunlight. He was fiercely protecting something incredibly precious from the harsh, unforgiving glare of the open valley. The heavy, dark shape cradled tightly against his massive body was not an animal carcass or gathered food. The undeniable, tragic truth of his agonizing midday march was finally, brutally revealed to the lens. As the creature slowly turned toward the exact center of the meadow, the viewing angle dramatically changed. The harsh midday sunlight suddenly illuminated the massive, dark shape cradled tightly in his arms. It was absolutely not a freshly killed deer or a scavenged animal carcass from the timber. The terrifying, undeniable truth was that he was carefully carrying another of his own kind. This secondary figure was significantly smaller and completely devoid of any independent, living motion. The shocking realization of what I was actively filming violently punched the breath from my lungs. The smaller Sasquatch was held incredibly tight against the adult's broad, heavily muscled chest. Its delicate, heavily furred arms dangled loosely and completely lifelessly toward the dry earth. There was absolutely no instinctive clinging or desperate biological struggling from the smaller passenger. The adult supported the entire limp weight with a terrifying, gentle and deliberate physical care. The stark contrast between the towering, powerful patriarch and the fragile burden was profoundly unsettling. I was documenting a heartbreaking biological tableau that completely defied all established cryptozoological theories. The bright daylight offered an unprecedented, highly detailed look at the juvenile's physical state. Its thinner, lighter-colored fur was heavily coated in a thick layer of fine mountain dust. This pale, suffocating dirt completely dulled the natural, healthy sheen of its young, primeval coat. The dry red soil of the canyon clung stubbornly to its motionless, incredibly fragile limbs. It looked exactly as though the small creature had been dragged or had fallen heavily. The tragic, absolute stillness of its small body quickly confirmed my absolute darkest fears. The most devastating visual detail was the tragic positioning of the young one's head. It was lolling, completely lifelessly backward against the adult male's massive, sweating bicep. The unnatural angle of its thin neck indicated a total, absolute loss of muscle tone. The giant's incredibly thick, leathery fingers were wrapped protectively around the juvenile's small torso. He held the fragile body with an agonizing, deeply profound tenderness, that shattered my rigid expectations. The sheer gravity of the devastating emotional situation finally, completely sank into my watching mind. This was undeniably not a biological specimen being dragged back to a dark, hidden den. It absolutely wasn't a feral, bloodthirsty predator returning to the timber with a fresh kill. His agonizing, hunched posture completely contradicted every single violent, monstrous narrative ever aggressively told. This was a profoundly intimate, heartbreaking moment, unfolding entirely in the unforgiving open daylight. It forcefully demanded a complete, immediate re-evaluation of the creature's deep, internal emotional capacity. I was watching a sentient being actively experience a level of trauma that transcended species boundaries. The undeniable, tragic reality was that this was a father holding his dead child. The staggering weight he struggled to carry was both immensely physical and profoundly, deeply emotional. The unyielding, brutal summer sun acted as a harsh, unblinking spotlight on his agonizing tragedy. It offered absolutely no comforting dark shadows to hide his immense, overwhelming parental grief. The absolute silent isolation of the dry canyon perfectly amplified the devastating sorrow of the scene. He was entirely alone with his catastrophic loss in the middle of the baking yellow meadow. The heavy magnetic tape was actively capturing the raw, unedited reality of the harsh wilderness. It was officially recording a devastating, universal experience of profound loss that flawlessly mirrors our own. The vast, terrifying evolutionary gap between our two distinct species suddenly felt entirely, completely insignificant. Devastating emotional pain and deep, agonizing mourning were clearly not exclusive, arrogant traits of human beings. The staggering footage instantly elevated the massive creature from a mythical animal to a sentient soul. It fundamentally altered the very definition of humanity I had blindly believed my entire life. The giant's erratic, stumbling gait was now completely understood as the physical manifestation of deep despair. His massive, heavily muscled chest was heaving from profound sorrow just as much as heat exhaustion. He held the small, dusty body tightly against the rhythm of his own heavy, agonizing heartbeat. He was perhaps hoping for an impossible, miraculous spark of life that the brutal canyon would deny. The devastating tragedy continued to slowly unfold, in agonizingly slow motion directly through my camera lens. I wiped a stray, salty tear from my own eye, completely overwhelmed by his silent, massive agony. I felt an immense, suffocating burden of guilt for witnessing this incredibly sacred, painful moment. The heavy plastic camera felt like a profoundly invasive, cruel, and entirely unnatural electronic instrument. Yet, my exhausted, trembling hands were completely paralyzed. Entirely unable to lower the recording lens, I was actively documenting the violent, silent breaking of a giant's heart in the bright sun. This single, staggering moment permanently and irrevocably changed my entire foundational understanding of the natural world. I knew that my own life was now officially divided into everything before and after this tape. The massive, grieving father finally stopped his agonizing, stumbling march through the dry sagebrush entirely. He stood completely still in the baking heat, his massive feet planted firmly in the dirt. He slowly and deliberately tilted his massive, heavy head back toward the cloudless blue sky. His incredibly broad chest aggressively expanded, drawing in a massive volume of the scorching summer air. The oppressive, sweltering silence of the dry canyon floor was about to be violently, irrevocably shattered. My camera's small integrated microphone was perfectly poised to capture the impending, devastating emotional release. The small integrated microphone on my heavy camcorder was notoriously terrible at filtering background noise. But on that sweltering August afternoon in 1998, the canyon was wrapped in an absolute, suffocating silence. The harsh summer heat had completely killed the usual chaotic afternoon drafts that swept the meadow. There was absolutely no howling wind to violently distort the delicate magnetic audio recording tape. The profound absence of ambient sound transformed the dry valley into a perfect, natural acoustic amphitheater. My trembling hands tightly gripped the plastic casing, completely unprepared for the impending acoustic shock. I watched through the digital viewfinder as the massive creature prepared his immense vocal cords. He drew in a staggering, incredibly deep breath that visibly expanded his broad, heavily muscled chest. The sheer volume of scorching summer air entering his massive lungs was mathematically impossible for a human. He tilted his heavy, dark head further back toward the unforgiving, cloudless blue sky above him. His thick, leathery lips slowly parted, revealing the terrifying primeval architecture of his massive jaw. The agonizing anticipation of a deafening territorial roar violently seized my exhausted, sun-baked mind. But the towering, devastated father did not unleash a feral, blood-curdling scream of pure rage. Instead, the male Sasquatch let out a sound I can only accurately describe as a hollowed whistle. It began as a low, incredibly mournful vibration, originating deep within his massive, powerful diaphragm. This was not the aggressive, chest-beating intimidation tactic aggressively detailed in popular cryptozoology lore. It was a staggering, complex frequency that felt ancient, deeply sorrowful, and entirely, profoundly tragic. The pure, devastating grief carried in that single, sustained note completely transcended our evolutionary divide. The raw acoustic power of his agonizing sorrow did not just register in my human ears. The incredibly low frequency physically bypassed my eardrums entirely and vibrated violently straight into my bones. I could actually feel the heavy, mournful resonance shaking the corrugated metal roof beneath my boots. It felt as though the dry, parched earth of the canyon was actively weeping with the giant. The sheer physical density of the sound was unlike any biological acoustic phenomenon I had ever encountered. It was a crushing physical wave of pure despair, washing completely over my small, isolated cabin. The deep, resonant vibration slowly stretched out, holding its terrifying pitch for an impossibly long time. His massive lung capacity allowed the hollowed whistle to echo endlessly across the baking, yellow meadow. Then the immense, powerful note began to tragically, agonizingly fracture into something even more devastating. The deep frequency trailed off into a jagged, high-pitched, and incredibly human-like whimper of defeat. That final, broken vocalization completely shattered the terrifying, monstrous illusion of the legendary apex predator. It was the undeniable, pathetic sound of a completely broken spirit surrendering to catastrophic loss. Listening to that broken whimper completely reframed my entire understanding of the mysterious high timber. For decades, terrified hikers had aggressively reported hearing massive, terrifying howls echoing through the dark woods. We had always arrogantly assumed these were strictly violent territorial warnings meant to frighten us away. But standing on my roof in 1998, a profound, heartbreaking alternative violently struck my mind. Sometimes those terrifying, booming noises echoing through the ancient hemlocks are absolutely not threats at all. They are a deeply sacred, highly emotional liturgy actively sung for the fallen, primeval dead. The audio captured on that Hi-8 tape is undeniably the most haunting aspect of the entire footage. It is the specific, terrible sound that routinely invaded my nightmares and stole my sleep for 30 years. I would frequently wake up in cold sweats, my ears ringing with that jagged, human-like whimper. The sheer, naked, emotional vulnerability recorded on the magnetic tape was incredibly difficult to safely process. It was a terrifying, beautiful, auditory ghost, permanently haunting the small, dusty confines of my cabin. No amount of rational, scientific detachment could ever successfully shield my heart from that desperate cry. As the final heartbreaking echo of the whistle slowly died in the dry canyon, the giant deflated. His massive, broad shoulders slumped even further forward, completely exhausted by the immense emotional output. He gently adjusted his thick, leathery grip on the lifeless, dusty juvenile cradled against his chest. The profound, suffocating silence of the sweltering August afternoon immediately rushed back in to fill the void. He stood entirely motionless in the baking heat, a tragic, towering monument of absolute, crushing despair. The brutal, unforgiving sun continued to mercilessly beat down upon his dark, heavily furred back. I remained completely frozen on the blistering metal roof, the heavy camcorder still pressed to my eye. I was no longer a detached, objective observer, documenting an unclassified biological specimen for science. I was a quiet, highly sympathetic witness to a deeply personal, incredibly profound interspecies funeral rite. The vast, terrifying differences in our physical biology were completely erased by the shared experience of grief. My own human heart ached terribly for the massive, suffering father standing alone in the dry meadow. The raw, unfiltered sorrow I had just recorded was the absolute purest truth of the hidden woods. The towering patriarch slowly lowered his massive head, returning his full, devastating attention to the fragile child. He knew that his agonizing acoustic liturgy was only the first necessary step of his terrible duty. He could not simply abandon the small, lifeless body to the harsh elements and scavenging valley predators. His heavy, flat feet slowly began to shuffle forward again, searching for the perfect, sacred spot. He was actively preparing to perform a meticulous, highly complex physical task in the baking yellow dust. I carefully adjusted the camera's focus, entirely unprepared for the profound, deliberate actions he would take next. I watched through the digital viewfinder as the massive male finally stopped his agonizing, stumbling march. He slowly and deliberately lowered his towering frame toward the parched, unyielding earth of the canyon floor. His massive, heavily muscled knees violently impacted the dry dirt. instantly kicking up thick plumes of red dust. The suffocating powdery dirt violently swirled around his thick legs in the stifling, completely windless summer air. He gently settled the lifeless, fragile body of the juvenile onto the baking yellow grass with profound care. The sheer physical gentleness he displayed completely contradicted the terrifying, immense power resting in his massive arms. The towering patriarch absolutely did not just carelessly abandon the small, dusty body to the harsh valley elements. He remained kneeling in the scorching dirt for several agonizing minutes, his massive head bowed in silent mourning. His thick, leathery hands gently smoothed the matted, dirty fur on the young Sasquatch's perfectly still chest. It was a deeply intimate, heartbreaking gesture of final parental comfort performed under the unforgiving midday sun. The brutal, unshielded heat continued to aggressively punish his dark, dense coat, but he entirely ignored the physical suffering. He was completely consumed by a profound, inescapable sorrow that mathematically dwarfed the punishing temperature of the canyon. Slowly, the grieving giant pushed himself back up to his massive, flat feet with an exhausted, heavy groan. He turned his broad, sweat-drenched back to my hidden camera lens and trudged heavily toward the distant tree line. I frantically held my breath, irrationally terrified that he was simply walking away and leaving his child behind. But the massive creature only approached the dense, shaded edge of the ancient, towering hemlock and cedar forest. He reached his incredibly long, powerful arms high up into the thick green canopy of a massive cedar tree. With terrifying, effortless strength, he meticulously began breaking off several incredibly heavy, thick boughs of fresh, fragrant greenery. The loud, aggressive snapping of the thick live wood echoed sharply against the steep, rocky walls of the canyon. He purposefully selected only the most robust, densely needled branches to carry back out into the sweltering meadow. His massive hands effortlessly stripped away any sharp, broken splinters that might inadvertently disrespect the fragile body waiting below. The giant cradled the heavy bundle of fresh cedar tightly against his heaving chest, entirely ignoring the sticky sap. He lumbered heavily back toward the center of the baking, yellow clearing where his tragic, silent burden lay waiting. He was actively, painstakingly gathering the necessary natural materials to perform an incredibly complex, deeply sacred forest ritual. The creature knelt heavily beside the juvenile once again, sending another thick cloud of red dust into the air. He began to carefully, deliberately lay the massive cedar boughs directly over the small, lifeless, and dusty body. His thick, leathery fingers meticulously arranged the fragrant green needles to perfectly cover the young one's pale face. He tucked the heavy branches tightly around the small torso, creating a beautiful, natural shroud of fresh mountain timber. The stark, vibrant green of the freshly broken cedar provided a heartbreaking visual contrast against the dry, yellow grass. The massive father was actively, intentionally shielding his dead child from the harsh, unblinking glare of the summer sun. This profound, deliberate act of covering the dead completely shattered every arrogant, human-centric biological theory I had ever read. It proved with absolute, terrifying certainty that these massive hominids fundamentally understood the complex concept of physical mortality. They possessed a deep cultural reverence for their deceased that required a specific, labor-intensive, and highly emotional physical response. The giant was not acting entirely on base primal instinct. He was executing a deeply ingrained, interspecies funeral tradition. My trembling hands struggled desperately to keep the heavy camcorder completely steady on the blistering, corrugated metal cabin roof. I was actively documenting the undeniable cognitive brilliance of a species the modern world vehemently claimed did not exist. Once the juvenile was completely shrouded in the fresh green cedar, the massive father slowly stood up again. He turned his devastating, weary attention toward the dry, rocky creek bed winding through the edge of the clearing. He trudged heavily over to the shallow ravine, his massive feet sinking deeply into the loose, treacherous gravel bank. The giant bent his enormous, powerful back and began actively searching through the bone-dry riverbed for specific, heavy materials. He selectively gathered several incredibly large, flat river stones, pulling them effortlessly from the baked, unyielding red clay dirt. Each massive gray rock he selected likely weighed well over a solid, punishing 100 pounds of dense granite. The towering patriarch carried the incredibly heavy stones back to the sacred green cedar mound resting in the sun. He did not carelessly toss the massive rocks onto the fragile branches, covering his child's small, perfectly still body. He knelt down and meticulously, gently placed each 100-pound stone directly over the thick layer of fresh greenery. He was actively, painstakingly, constructing a heavy, protective physical cairn to completely secure the shallow, sun-drenched valley grave. The massive rocks would successfully prevent the hungry, opportunistic mountain scavengers from eventually disturbing the sacred, peaceful resting place. His immense, terrifying physical strength was being utilized entirely for an act of profound, incredibly delicate parental love. The sweltering, unforgiving afternoon dragged on as the massive giant continued his grueling, incredibly heavy labor in the sun. He made dozens of agonizing, exhausted trips back and forth between the dry creek bed and the growing cairn. The brutal heat actively sapped his massive, terrifying energy, causing his broad, fur-covered shoulders to slump even further forward. Yet he absolutely refused to abandon his heartbreaking, meticulous task until the rocky monument was completely, perfectly finished. He stacked the heavy, flat river stones with an incredible structural precision that entirely defied his monstrous, feral appearance. The final protective tomb was a beautiful, undeniable testament to the complex, highly intelligent soul of the high timber. When the heavy, rocky cairn was finally completed, the devastated giant did not immediately retreat into the dark woods. He simply slumped heavily to the dry, dusty earth directly beside the massive pile of grey river stones. He stayed there for several agonizing hours in the stifling, punishing heat, completely motionless beside the heavy rock grave. His massive, dark silhouette became a tragic, permanent monument of grief against the backdrop of the shimmering, distant pines. The heavy, high-8 magnetic tape continued to faithfully spin, capturing his silent, devastating vigil as the afternoon sun shifted. Eventually, the massive creature would have to finally stand up, forcing him to completely acknowledge his empty, silent surroundings. The brutal, unyielding sun finally began its slow, inevitable descent toward the jagged western ridges of the canyon. The long, stretching shadows of the ancient hemlocks slowly crept across the dry, yellow grass of the baking meadow. The massive, dark silhouette of the grieving giant remained perfectly still beside the freshly built, heavy riverstone cairn. He had sat completely motionless for hours, a towering, furry monument of absolute despair anchored to the dusty earth. The heavy, high-8 magnetic tape in my overheating camcorder was dangerously close to reaching its absolute physical recording limit. My cramped, sunburned hands ached terribly from gripping the heavy plastic casing against the scorching, corrugated metal cabin roof. Suddenly, the towering patriarch let out a deep, shuddering sigh that visibly heaved his massive, heavily muscled chest. He placed one thick, leathery hand gently onto the top of the highest grey stone resting on the grave. It was a final, heartbreaking physical connection to the fragile, dusty child he was forced to leave entirely behind. Slowly, the immense creature pushed himself up from the parched red dirt with a heavy, deeply exhausted physical groan. His massive knees popped loudly in the quiet, stifling canyon air as he straightened his 9-foot-tall, towering frame. The giant stood completely upright, his broad, fur-covered back still facing my distant, hidden vantage point on the roof. He took one slow, incredibly heavy step away from the green cedar and grey granite monument he had constructed. The creature did not immediately bolt toward the protective, dark cover of the dense tree line like a startled animal. Instead, he paused his massive, lumbering stride and slowly began to pivot his enormous torso back toward the clearing. The giant deliberately turned his massive head, rotating his thick neck to survey the entire, silent expanse of the valley. He was not looking for opportunistic predators or scanning the dry sagebrush for potential, immediate physical threats to himself. His wide, sweeping gaze was actively searching for something entirely different in the sweltering, unforgiving heat of the afternoon. The creature's slow, sweeping rotation finally brought his massive, heavily browed face directly into my camera's digital viewfinder. My heart slammed violently against my ribs as the powerful optical zoom locked perfectly onto his dark, primeval features. In the stark, clear daylight of the canyon, the terrifying, mythical beast was stripped of all his shadowed ambiguity. I could see the deep, weary wrinkles etched heavily into the thick, leathery skin surrounding his massive, flat nose. His thick lips were pressed tightly together in a grim, agonizing line of profound, inescapable emotional suffering and loss. But it was the sudden, direct alignment of his incredible eyes that completely paralyzed my terrified, watching human mind. He stopped his sweeping gaze the exact moment his massive face perfectly aligned with the pitch of my roof. The giant was looking entirely, unmistakably straight into the sensitive glass lens of my heavy, humming, high-8 video camcorder. Through the digital viewfinder, I could clearly see his massive, wide eyes, which were a striking, vibrant amber color. They were not the dead black soulless orbs often aggressively described in terrifying, late-night cryptozoological campfire stories and folklore. His amber eyes were filled to the absolute brim with a weary, profound, and overwhelmingly agonizing level of intelligence. I was staring directly into the ancient sentient soul of a sovereign king who had just buried his heir. A cold, terrifying wave of absolute certainty violently washed over my sunburned, exhausted body, resting on the hot metal. He absolutely knew that I was hiding up there, perched precariously on the baking roof of my isolated cabin. He possessed the highly advanced predatory senses to easily detect my scent and hear my panicked, rapid human heartbeat. He undeniably knew that the large, sensitive glass of my camera lens was actively reflecting the harsh summer sun. Yet, he made absolutely no aggressive, territorial move to charge across the dry meadow and violently destroy the witness. In that profound, shared space of devastating, crushing grief, the paramount secret of his biological existence simply didn't matter. He was no longer a terrified, elusive cryptid, desperately avoiding any visual contact with a destructive modern human being. He was a deeply broken, mourning father, actively choosing to acknowledge the quiet, sympathetic witness watching from the distance. The vast, terrifying evolutionary gulf separating our two distinct species instantly evaporated in the sweltering, dry air of the canyon. We were simply two fragile biological entities silently sharing the immense, crushing weight of a tragic, universal mortality event. He held my terrified, unblinking gaze through the electronic viewfinder for several long, incredibly tense and utterly profound seconds. The oppressive, silent heat of the valley floor seemed to perfectly freeze that impossible, cross-species visual connection in time. I remained completely motionless, terrified that any sudden, jerky movement would instantly break the delicate, sacred trust he offered. I desperately wanted to lower the heavy plastic camera and offer a respectful human gesture of deep, mutual sorrow. But I was entirely a prisoner of the electronic recording, absolutely compelled to document every single fraction of a second. The towering, majestic giant finally blinked his massive amber eyes, slowly breaking the intense, mesmerizing spell of our connection. He tilted his heavy, dark head forward just a fraction of an inch in the glaring, unforgiving sunlight. It was a single, incredibly slow, and undeniably deliberate nod, directed precisely at my hidden position on the roof. That subtle, majestic nod was a profound, silent confirmation of our shared, impossible reality in the high mountain timber. It was a quiet, dignified request for respectful silence regarding the sacred, dusty tomb he had built in the meadow. The giant then slowly turned his massive back to me one final, heartbreaking time in the sweltering August heat. He took a long, heavy stride toward the cool, inviting shadows of the ancient, towering hemlocks bordering the clearing. The massive, dark silhouette seamlessly blended into the dense, impenetrable wall of green timber with terrifying, flawless evolutionary stealth. He simply vanished like a massive biological ghost, leaving the baking canyon floor entirely empty and completely devastatingly silent. The small blinking red recording light on my camcorder finally clicked off as the heavy magnetic tape completely ran out. I slowly lowered the hot plastic casing from my stinging eye, violently gasping for the thin, scorching mountain air. My entire body shook uncontrollably against the corrugated metal roof as the immense, crushing reality of the afternoon hit me. I had successfully captured the absolute, undeniable holy grail of modern biology entirely on a cheap, consumer-grade video cassette. The profound, heartbreaking intelligence I had just witnessed completely destroyed any arrogant human desire for fame or scientific recognition. The heavy burden of deciding exactly what to do with that explosive, world-shattering footage now rested entirely on my shoulders. When the pale, cool dawn finally broke over the canyon the next morning, I was completely physically and emotionally shattered. I had spent the entire agonizing night pacing the small wooden floorboards of my isolated cabin in absolute, suffocating silence. The heavy, high-8 magnetic tape sat completely motionless on my scratched wooden dining table like a highly radioactive alien artifact. Every time my exhausted, bloodshot eyes drifted toward the small plastic cassette, my lungs violently seized up in sheer panic. I was so completely overwhelmed by the profound, world-shattering implications of the footage that I literally couldn't catch my breath. I had successfully captured the ultimate, undeniable biological truth, but the resulting psychological burden felt like a terrifying, heavy death sentence. I sat down heavily in my worn armchair and desperately tried to rationally calculate my next immediate course of action. If I confidently marched down the mountain and released the explosive tape to the eager 1998 Evening News, everything would change. The sensationalist media networks would instantly transform my quiet, isolated valley into a chaotic, loud, and incredibly destructive forensic circus. Hundreds of ambitious, aggressive journalists and amateur cryptozoologists would violently descend upon the fragile, dry canyon ecosystem overnight to investigate. They would aggressively trample the brittle sagebrush, desperately searching for the exact, GPS-coordinated location of the tragic midday encounter. The sacred, silent peace of the towering hemlock forest would be permanently, violently shattered by the terrifying roar of news helicopters. But the absolute most terrifying threat did not come from the flashing cameras of the loud, chaotic television news crews. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty exactly how the arrogant established scientific community would aggressively react to the unprecedented footage. They would never simply accept the grainy magnetic videotape as definitive, undeniable proof of a massive, unclassified hominid species. Ambitious, cold-blooded researchers would immediately demand the hard, physical, and highly gruesome forensic evidence to justify rewriting their thick textbooks. They would violently tear apart that beautiful green cedar and heavy gray granite monument without a single ounce of hesitation. I absolutely could not allow those arrogant academics to dig up that fragile child just to arrogantly prove a scientific point. I closed my exhausted eyes and vividly pictured the massive amber eyes of the grieving father looking directly at me. He had offered me a profound, silent trust when he deliberately nodded toward my hidden position on the blistering hot roof. Betraying that incredible cross-species moment of mutual respect for a fleeting moment of cheap human fame felt fundamentally, deeply evil. The towering giant had actively chosen to peacefully mourn his tragic loss instead of violently attacking my vulnerable, isolated cabin. I owed him an immense, unpayable debt of absolute silence regarding the specific sacred location of his child's resting place. The profound choice between validating my own sanity to the world and protecting his deep dignity was incredibly easy to make. I slowly stood up from my armchair, my mind finally resolutely made up regarding the fate of the heavy magnetic tape. I carefully picked up the small black plastic cassette from the dining table. With trembling, deeply reverent and terrified human hands, I walked over to my disorganized storage closet and retrieved a heavy, highly durable and completely waterproof metal ammunition canister. I gently placed the explosive, world-shattering biological evidence deep inside the dark protective cylinder and sealed the heavy lid tightly. I grabbed a rusted iron crowbar and a small wooden-handled shovel from the cluttered, dusty corner of my small kitchen. I quietly stepped out of the back door of the cabin, entering the cool, refreshing shadows of the early mountain morning. The small, dilapidated wooden storage shed sat about 50 precarious yards behind my main cabin, nestled deep in the dark pines. I practically held my breath as I quickly walked across the damp morning grass, terrified of being secretly watched from the timber. I pushed open the creaking, heavy wooden door of the old shed and stepped into the dusty, entirely lightless interior space. I used the heavy iron crowbar to violently pry up several thick, stubborn floorboards in the absolute darkest, furthest back corner. The damp, dark earth completely exposed beneath the structure smelled strongly of ancient pine needles and cold, decaying mountain soil. I fell heavily to my knees and began to aggressively dig a deep, narrow hole directly into the freezing, unyielding dirt. The intense physical exertion of digging in the cramped, dark space quickly warmed my exhausted, completely sleep-deprived human body. I hollowed out a cavity nearly 3 feet deep, ensuring the waterproof canister would easily survive the freezing, brutal winter frosts. I carefully lowered the heavy metal cylinder into the dark, damp hole, treating it like a profoundly sacred, buried treasure. The explosive, world-altering truth of the high timber was now successfully entombed far below the sturdy wooden floorboards of my property. I forcefully packed the loose, cold dirt back over the canister, completely erasing all visible signs of my desperate morning excavation. I carefully nailed the thick wooden floorboards back into their original dusty positions, permanently sealing the historic hidden vault entirely shut. I stood up in the dark shed, wiping the damp, cold mountain dirt violently from my trembling, calloused hands and jeans. A profound, incredibly heavy sense of absolute finality instantly washed over my exhausted mind. In the quiet, dusty darkness of the room, I had successfully protected the majestic, grieving father from the aggressive, destructive curiosity of the modern, civilized human world outside. The sacred, heavy riverstone cairn resting in the baking meadow would remain completely, entirely undisturbed by invasive scientific hands. I deliberately chose to let the massive Sasquatch have his well-deserved peace, completely regardless of the immense personal cost to myself. I walked back to my empty cabin, fully prepared to silently shoulder the massive, suffocating burden of the hidden truth alone. The next 3 decades of my isolated mountain life were completely defined by that single, desperate morning in the dark shed. I silently endured the mocking laughter of skeptical hikers who arrogantly claimed the towering forest giants were just ridiculous, childish myths. I bit my tongue so hard it frequently bled whenever loud, aggressive hunters boasted about conquering the deep, dark timber. I actively allowed the entire arrogant world to confidently believe I was just another crazy, delusional old man spinning wild lies. The heavy magnetic tape remained completely silent and perfectly safe deep beneath the freezing dirt for 30 long, agonizing years. But the profound emotional memory of that jagged, human-like whimper never once faded from my haunted, completely exhausted mind. The relentless passage of 30 years fundamentally changes the entire complex landscape of both the natural world and human society. My own fragile human body has grown incredibly old and weak, no longer physically able to fiercely guard the dark timber. The arrogant, established scientific community has also slowly begun to crack under the massive weight of new, undeniable environmental discoveries. I recently found myself staring intensely at the dusty floorboards of the old shed, feeling a strange, new compulsion entirely. The heavy waterproof metal canister has patiently waited in the absolute dark for exactly the right, profound historical moment to emerge. The freezing mountain dirt is finally ready to violently surrender the devastating, beautiful truth it has protected for so incredibly long. Digging up the heavy metal canister in the bitter spring of 2026 felt exactly like violently reopening an ancient, festering wound. My arthritic, trembling hands struggled terribly to grip the rusted iron crowbar against the stubborn, dusty floorboards of the old shed. The freezing, damp mountain dirt had securely held the explosive biological secret perfectly safe for 3 incredibly long, silent decades. As I finally pulled the waterproof cylinder from the dark earth, a profound, suffocating wave of intense grief washed over me. The 30 years of absolute isolating silence had taken a massive, devastating psychological toll on my exhausted, aging human mind. It was finally, undeniably time that the arrogant, modern world actively understands the profound truth buried in this high timber. The legendary Bigfoot is absolutely not a feral, bloodthirsty monster to be aggressively hunted or a grotesque trophy to be claimed. They are a highly advanced, sentient, and profoundly emotional people who actively love and deeply lose just as we do. The terrifying, monstrous caricatures aggressively plastered across cheap tabloid magazines completely strip these majestic beings of their undeniable biological dignity. We have spent decades arrogantly projecting our own dark, violent human fears directly onto the quiet shadows of the ancient forest. The staggering footage permanently locked inside this small plastic cassette violently shatters every single established hostile myth we have created. It forcefully demands a complete, immediate, and highly uncomfortable re-evaluation of our rigid, arrogant place within the natural biological order. The mourning tape serves as the absolute definitive proof that the vast wilderness is not a vacant, empty physical space. It is a vibrant, deeply populated home, completely filled with incredible untold stories of massive resilience and devastating, crushing heartbreak. The heavy riverstones carefully stacked in that sun-drenched meadow represent a profound, ancient culture thriving entirely outside our understanding. Every single branch of fresh cedar meticulously placed over that fragile body was a deliberate, undeniable act of profound love. My grainy, degraded Hi8 footage captures the raw, unfiltered essence of a sovereign species, navigating the agonizing reality of mortality. It absolutely proves that the terrifying dark timber possesses a deep, complex, and incredibly beautiful soul we have actively ignored. The modern, civilized world has grown increasingly disconnected from the raw, primeval pulse of the ancient earth in recent years. We confidently hide behind glowing digital screens, arrogantly believing we have successfully conquered and perfectly categorized the entire natural environment. Releasing this explosive magnetic tape into the public sphere will instantly, violently disrupt that fragile, comforting illusion of supreme human dominance. I fully expect immediate, aggressive backlash from skeptical scientists desperately trying to protect their rigid, established evolutionary textbooks and careers. They will undoubtedly attempt to aggressively dismiss the staggering footage as an incredibly elaborate, highly funded, and perfectly executed hoax. But the raw, undeniable emotional weight radiating from those massive amber eyes cannot be easily faked or casually explained away. The scientific community will furiously debate the anatomical proportions and the heavy, stumbling gait captured in the bright summer sunlight. However, they will never be able to rationally dismiss the devastating hollowed whistle permanently etched onto the magnetic audio track. That deep, resonant vibration that violently shook my corrugated metal roof is the undeniable acoustic signature of absolute crushing despair. It completely bypasses all logical academic analysis and violently strikes the very core of our shared, universal mammalian empathy and understanding. Anyone who actually listens to that jagged, human-like whimper will instantly recognize the profound, inescapable agony of a broken parent. The sound alone fundamentally bridges the terrifying, massive evolutionary gap that has artificially separated our two distinct species for millennia. Even as I prepare to finally release this world-shattering footage, I refuse to completely surrender all of my heavy secrets. The exact GPS-coordinated location of the dry, sun-drenched meadow and the heavy stone cairn will permanently die with me. I will never actively provide the aggressive, invasive modern media with the precise map required to disturb that sacred ground. The fragile, dusty child resting peacefully beneath the fresh cedar and heavy granite absolutely deserves to remain perfectly, entirely undisturbed. If ambitious researchers violently dig up those small, fragile bones, the profound empathetic message of the mourning tape is instantly destroyed. We must learn to respectfully observe the undeniable truth without aggressively destroying the very sacred subjects we proudly claim to study. My own fragile, purely human body is rapidly failing, mirroring the slow, inevitable decay of the old wooden cabin itself. The harsh, punishing Cascade winters have permanently settled deep into my aching bones, making daily mountain survival an exhausting chore. I am acutely aware that my personal biological timeline is rapidly drawing to a quiet, completely inevitable and silent close. Holding on to this massive radioactive secret any longer would mean risking its complete permanent loss to the dark, damp earth. I cannot confidently allow the profound, majestic legacy of that grieving giant to completely vanish into the forgotten historical shadows. The massive burden of the absolute truth must finally be aggressively shifted from my exhausted shoulders to the broader world. The 30-year period of suffocating, isolated silence I imposed upon myself has officially, irrevocably reached its absolute final end. I'm no longer a terrified, overwhelmed young man, desperately hiding from the monumental, world-shattering implications of the high timber. I am an old, weary witness stepping forward to finally advocate for the sovereign, intelligent giants hidden in the deep woods. They do not need our aggressive, violent protection, but they absolutely demand our profound, respectful, and completely silent evolutionary acknowledgement. We must completely abandon our arrogant assumption that the dark forest is devoid of sentient, highly complex, and emotional life. The mourning tape is a loud, undeniable clarion call to finally awaken our dormant, primal connection to the natural earth. I carefully wipe the stubborn, 30-year-old dirt completely off the heavy, waterproof metal canister sitting on my dining room table. I gently extract the small black plastic hi-8 cassette, visually inspecting the delicate magnetic tape for any obvious catastrophic degradation. Miraculously, the freezing mountain soil has perfectly preserved the fragile electronic record of that sweltering, devastating August afternoon in 1998. I slide the tape into a heavily padded, secure mailing envelope addressed directly to a trusted, highly respected independent archivist. I include a thick, handwritten manuscript meticulously detailing the exact, terrifying sequence of events that occurred under the midday sun. This comprehensive physical package represents the absolute totality of my life's work and my final, lasting contribution to human knowledge. Before I finally drive down the steep mountain road to officially mail the package, I step outside onto the porch. The canyon is completely silent today, wrapped in a thick, cool and comforting layer of dense, damp Pacific Northwest fog. I look intently toward the exact hidden location of the distant meadow, knowing the heavy stone cairn still rests there. The majestic, grieving father who once stumbled through the dry sagebrush has likely long since passed into the ancient earth. But his profound, undeniable legacy of immense parental love and devastating heartbreak is about to violently change the entire world. I hope we are finally ready to quietly sit down, completely abandon our arrogance, and simply listen to the hidden forest